This is the first 2025 research seminar for the Arch Network. My name is Lisa Berry. I'm one of the co-directors of the Arch Network, along with Jen James and Bree Williams. Bree is a bit under the weather, so if she joins us today, it'll just be kind of by viewing with her camera off. As far as my background, I'm a chronic disease epidemiologist, have always focused in geriatrics, and obviously have an interest in the older justice-involved population. So as you can probably see, as people are joining us, if you want to put a little blurb about yourself in the chat, I see we have people from all over the country, which is great. Some who recently got some snow, I guess, rather unexpectedly or unusually. So we have folks here that are at the National Institutes of Health. I think some not-for-profit organizations, a lot from academia, and we've got people at all stages of their careers. So you're all welcome. This is a great place to get to know others that are interested in issues related to aging and the justice system. And we look forward to your feedback, certainly. And do we want to say something first about the meeting? I don't know, Jen, do you want to talk a bit about that, or Jamila?
Sure, the March meeting.
Yeah, why don't we just
Yeah.
get some business out of the way, I guess, first.
Yeah, great. So just the reminder, I think folks have hopefully seen emails. We are having a half-day pre-meeting before ACCJH. ACCJH is the Academic Consortium on Criminal Justice and Health, or someone correct me if that is not what it stands for, but I think I'm right. The meeting this year is going to be in Austin, Texas. That meeting starts March 17th. Excuse me. So we are having our this is, I think, the first time we're really having an in-person meeting, which is exciting. We planned to do it, and then there was a pandemic the day before on March 16th. So if you have not already let Jamila know that you're planning to come, please do. We hope to see many of you. We're putting together the program right now. It's going to be some workshop, skill building stuff. There's going to be works in progress. There's going to be some planning of goals, future ideas, leadership opportunities within the network. There's going to be snacks of some kind. It's going to be great. So I hope to see many of you there.
Great. All right. Well, today we have two research presentations, and so wanted to jump in because we definitely want to have some time for discussion. The first speaker we have today is for one of our works in progress sessions, and that's Dr. Stephanie Grace Prost. She's an associate professor at the Raymond A. Kent School of Social Work and Family Science at the University of Louisville. And Dr. Prost received her MSW and her PhD in social work from Florida State University. Her research focuses on enhancing timely and targeted correctional health care to assure positive multi-system outcomes for persons receiving health services in our nation's jails and prisons, as well as their caregivers. And Dr. Prost has numerous publications and ongoing research projects in this area. In addition to her research, she's taught courses including social work and incarceration and forensic social work. And so today, for her work in progress discussion, she will talk about how anxiety contributes to physical health among older adults who are incarcerated in prison. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So is it okay if I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Didn't know what the logistics were. So go ahead and see if this works. My screen sharing. Do you see a presentation? Okay. All right. Excellent. So I actually feel a little funny calling this a work in progress because I'm very lucky to have just received notification that it was published online. So it's officially no longer in progress. And for that, I am very grateful and so humbled because that was a long process. But I'm actually presenting on behalf of a colleague of mine who I met through ACCJH, kind of inadvertently through kind of the mentorship structures that we're trying to create. who is a faculty at Northern Arizona University, Dr. Katie Momertz. So she was so grateful to have shared this presentation or this content with social work scholars just last week in Seattle, Washington, for the Society of Social Work and Research, or Society for Social Work and Research. And so now I have the opportunity to share it with you all. So if you have any questions that I can't answer, we'll blame it on Katie. Okay. A couple of quick disclosures. So let me start by thanking the Arch Network profusely for their support of the pilot data collection efforts that were instrumental to gathering data for the older adults in Kentucky State Prison study. The project was also supported in part by the University of Louisville, Executive Vice President of Research and Innovation, as well as our departmental seed grants. And quite critically, we acknowledge the Kentucky Department of Corrections' participation in this project, but findings from the study are neither approved nor endorsed by the department. Quick outline, as it is what we're up against today. I'll talk a bit about the context for the study, the questions that emerged based on existing scholarship, detail briefly the methods that were used to answer those research questions, and then spend some time with our individual results, and finally contextualizing what we've learned in areas of policy, practice, and research. I also just learned of a great resource. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of the presentation, for those of you who may not be aware, the Met hosts an open access public domain search forum where you can find beautiful art that exists throughout time and space that is freely accessible for use in all kinds of different avenues. So I've pulled the art for this presentation from that source, that web source, and I strongly encourage you all to use it. It's so great. So I've included a few pieces here, hopefully that helps set the stage for the conversation. So this here is the corridor in the asylum from Van Gogh. And the focus here really is understanding the older adult within the correctional environment, which feels a little moot for this particular population because this is old hat for everyone who's here, but just briefly, it is the largest age demographic and the largest growing age demographic within U.S. prisons, who are known, of course, to endure an earlier onset and greater frequency of life-limiting or chronic disease in this space. And that includes in comparisons with individuals who are incarcerated at younger ages, as well as when compared to their community dwelling peers. And while we know that prisons provide a great deal of mental health care, namely in the case of like group-related interventions as well as psychopharmaceuticals, great needs remain for persons who are incarcerated broadly, but perhaps for older adults specifically. So in terms of anxiety, the American Psychological Association kind of gives this broad definition regarding an experience marked by worry, a sense of restlessness or feeling on edge, and those related sort of somatic or activities of daily living consequences, such as sleep disturbance, for no less than 6 months. Using this definition, we know about 20% of the US population faces some sort of anxiety, with the greatest distribution represented among those with generalized anxiety disorder. Among older adults in the community, though, the proportion is lower, anywhere between 3 and 14% based on estimates from 2010. But scholars have remarked several important considerations that kind of pervade all geriatric medicine. You all know this, right? That these things are very difficult to assess in older adults, principally because of their entanglement with other common issues that appear in later life, including depression, confusion that may or may not be related to mild cognitive impairment. Issues with grief and loss can also look like anxiety in older adults. As a result of our difficulty assessing individuals, we often have difficulty treating folks. If we don't know there's a problem, we can't treat it, of course. Authors have also made the point that anxiety in older adults are marked by unique worries, including death anxiety, but not limited to a sense of burden upon themselves for relying on others, guilt associated with the disintegration of social networks and the like. And we also know that older adults do trend toward positive affect. Some of this could be a manifestation of coping strategies and the like. But based on these circumstances, we know that anxiety in an older adult is likely underdiagnosed. So the pathways for the connection between anxiety and physical health can look a lot of different ways. And while there is evidence in scholarship of sort of a recursive model whereby physical health problems also drive anxiety, two kind of predominant models include those linked to the C-reactive protein and then the HPA pathway. These are broadly understood to be driven by stress-related experiences, increased presence of certain hormones that can cause inflammation and thereby enhance the likelihood of morbidity. So this becomes particularly important in older adults because a large body of scholarship, and no doubt those of you in practice know that anxiety can manifest as other issues in older adults, increasing their risk of things like physical functioning impairment, as well as falls, gastrointestinal disease, and that study down there at the end, a slew of additional chronic health conditions. So because of its correlates and consequences, managing anxiety in an older adult is particularly important. However, no study to date has examined anxiety in the population as related to these physical health measures. So the research questions driven largely in part by my dear colleague, Katie, because this is her area, this sort of mind-body connection, is how can we describe the signs and symptoms of anxiety among this population, and how do those measures of anxiety link to physical health in the group? Likewise, can we distinguish between those with self-reported anxiety and those without, based on these measures? And perhaps most critically, can we say definitively in this sample that anxiety contributes to the manifestation of physical health among older adults in prison? So kind of a quick overview here of the methods. This is a kind of a dense slide, I apologize. But the data actually are secondary, drawn from a primary data collection effort that began in 2018, and the primary data collection ended in 2019. Shortly around the corner, we also were starting focus groups that were abruptly ended due to COVID in 2020. But the longitudinal data we'll actually receive this year, so that'll be our 5-year mark. But this is actually a sample of 499 persons who were interviewed face-to-face across 5 institutions in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And this represents individuals aged 45 or older who were not currently in segregation housing unit, disciplinary segregation, who were off-site for court or medical reasons, or those who were actively on suicide watch. So that's the kind of proportion of folks from whom we draw. We approached every single person who met the inclusion criteria, and that amounted to 499 folks having consented. That includes, or that is after 2 folks withdrew from the study after the initial consent process. So across the classifications, the idea here was to talk to a variety of folks in and out of maximum, minimum, and medium security spaces, as well as men and women. So the sample includes both men and women. And that study was principally aimed at understanding the portrait of an older adult in a Kentucky prison for a few reasons, but principally to aid the department in calling down resources, prioritizing, of course, decarceration, but to meet the needs of the population during their stay. So we interviewed folks face-to-face using tablets that were disconnected from the internet, but allowed a secured cache in public spaces, but outside of earshot, and asked a variety of questions that were both closed-ended and open-ended in terms of a qualitative approach, but also leaning heavily on standardized outcome measures that are used in research with older adults more broadly. Those measures include, for this study, the 20-item medical outcome study short form, the SF20, the World Health Organization's Quality of Life BREF, it's a 28-item measure, as well as the 8-item patient health questionnaire. Our principal outcome measures or correlates include activities of daily living, the impairment in the capacity to complete things like bathing, toileting, transferring, as well as a frequency of chronic disease that was ascertained by asking individuals if they had ever been diagnosed with a list of 14 conditions. We also assessed the influence of anxiety on physical health life quality using a subscale of the WHO-QoL-BREF, as well as the physical functioning subscale of the SF20. And then finally, using an open-ended response, we examined self-reported anxiety among older adults, coding individually each of the 499 cases based on what conditions individuals reported having at admission. The analyses are pretty run-of-the-mill, describing the sample and relationships among key measures using descriptive and bivariate statistics. examining distinctions between those with and without self-reported anxiety using an independent sample t-test and the standardized coefficient there of the Cohen's d. And then finally, the hierarchical multiple linear regression to examine the contribution of anxiety measures to physical health as nested within common correlates of physical health measures among the population. So there's a lot of tables here that are not terribly interesting. So I'll try to highlight, let me go back. I'll try to highlight those by using these sort of circles. I don't know if the contrast is quite as brilliant as I'd hoped. But broadly speaking, the sample was predominantly men whose average age was roughly 55, who had served about 12 years by the time we had an opportunity to interview them. In terms of signs and symptoms of anxiety, we see representations of nervousness, a sense of being fidgety, as well as negative feelings across the population. We see a relatively low self-reported ADL impairment and an average number of chronic health conditions hovering around 3.5, and moderate physical health, life quality, and physical functioning via interview. Okay. So in terms of intercorrelations among anxiety measures, we did find statistically significant correlations among those that were pulled from those standardized measures, which gives us the indication of appropriate construct validity since a principal anxiety measure was not used in the data collection effort. We also found likewise intercorrelations among our physical health measures, again, giving rise to that these hang well together, though they represent distinct constructs. In terms of the primary research question, however, we did find that all anxiety measures, signs and symptoms of anxiety used in the current study, did relate to those physical health measures within the study. Broadly speaking, as anxiety worsened, so too did physical health. In terms of assessing differences between those older adults who said they had anxiety and those who didn't, we actually found statistically significant differences across all measures between the groups. Importantly, however, and we'll bring this up later, both groups still had meaningful levels of anxiety and physical health issues. In terms of the contributions of anxiety to impairment in activities of daily living, we found that upon inclusion of common correlates of physical health among the population, such as gender, race, age, and current incarceration length, the experience of feeling nervous during the past 2 weeks, as well as a sense of feeling fidgety, these were both important contributions to ADL impairment in the sample. Likewise, when examining multimorbidity, which again is kind of a sum index that indicates a number of chronic health conditions, we found, again, the nervousness measure kind of rises to the top, as well as a sense of negative feelings, both contributing independently to multimorbidity in the sample. Physical health, quality of life, we find that all of the anxiety measures that were used from the data collection effort do contribute to this particular scale, which is actually, again, a subscale of the WHO-QoL-BREF. And I'll draw your attention to the R-square value for this measure. This model, was our strongest model for the particular study. So accounting for approximately, 37% of the variation in the outcome measure. So a great deal of the story remains untold, but again, the strongest model in this particular study. Finally, when looking at physical functioning, again, the signs and symptoms emerge as contributing to this particular outcome measure, with the strongest effect, again, among our nervousness item. So what does it all mean? So broadly speaking, we found that the proportion of those in the study had anxiety, which represents a greater proportion of those in community dwelling samples with older adults. Likewise, we also found that our proportion, which was about 25% or 20%, was greater than additional studies that have been done with populations who are incarcerated. However, we anticipate that this rate is still underreported based on standardized approaches. Anxiety related to all measures of physical health, which is something that continues to manifest in existing scholarship, but remains kind of less explored in our population, which means that kind of in terms of practice implications, there is a need for comorbid intervention. So focusing on both conditions concurrently so as to reduce the incidence of each. We found statistically significant differences between those with and without anxiety. Again, however, we found that those without self-reported anxiety still had elevated measures in terms of nervousness, fidgetiness, and then those negative feelings. But across the board, it is the nervous measure, which is drawn from one of those standardized assessments, but not the GAD, held the greatest sway in the population. So it hung most closely related to anxiety, signs and symptoms across each of the outcome measures in our regression models. In terms of implications for practice, there's a need for ongoing assessment, which I feel like we all say that in every manuscript we write about every condition that we examine. But what we found is that even though the National Survey of Prison Healthcare relates that mental health assessment is standard practice, there's not a clear indication that anxiety measures are a part of that assessment. Likewise, if that assessment takes place at admission, there's no clear indication that it takes place later on. And as individuals age, of course, all our geriatric physicians know, there's a need for concurrent assessment with other conditions common among older adults, but they need to increase in frequency. We also make the point that policy implications from this study can kind of be twofold. One, we shouldn't keep older adults in these spaces because of the risk of anxiety contributing to other physical health related issues. We ought prioritize, again, decarceration. However, there is some evidence that increasing social capital among older adults can reduce anxiety. So an innovative practice could be the use of visitation, structured visitation with or without loved ones for older adults to enhance social capital and thereby reduce anxiety in the group. Finally, in terms of implications for research, of course, the secondary data analysis was trying to answer a question for which a measure wasn't included in the initial analysis. The use of standardized approaches to capture anxiety in the population are strongly encouraged, as well as the use of path modeling, so as to capture antecedents of anxiety, what's actually driving the anxiety in the setting, and multi-level modeling to examine variation between institutions. I wanted to have like a final note as we're kind of turning the corner of this presentation before questions and answers to offer the influence of the ARCH network on this particular publication. So again, I noted that a colleague of mine presented this as a 7-minute flash talk in Seattle just this past week. But this project was actually rooted in a publication that we did back in 2022 that we started, I think, in 2021 with ARCH Network members related to the use of standardized outcome measures and their importance in research so as to allow for comparison, common language, the need for translation into practice. That actually led to one of our WIPs with Dr. Berry right here, having this opportunity to talk about the role of cognitive and functional impairment and the importance of measurement in those approaches as well. And then most recently, we published the first measurement study of a standardized approach to measuring life quality in the population in the International Journal of Prisoner Health. So they're all kind of interrelated. So I just wanted to offer that. Yes, thank you, ARCH Network, for your network. So that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Maybe you can put your little virtual hands up. That way I can see if anyone has any questions. I can start us off by, Stephanie, I know you said in the beginning, when you were talking about your recruitment, you said that you approached all of those who were age 45 and older.
Yes.
Can you detail, what do you mean by approach in the prison system?
Yes, absolutely. So I have the number here on a piece of paper next to my desk. 1,090 persons. So 1,090 persons. And so the way that this particular institution allowed us access was that a census was actually drafted 48 hours prior to our arrival. And it met all the inclusion criteria. So they populated a list that said, here's everybody who's 45 and older, who's not in the SHU, not off campus and the like. And so they actually did it in batches where individuals were called out. they were kind of made aware that this was going to happen. They were called out to a common location where we were briefly described that we were researchers at the University of Louisville, exploring the experiences of older adults in the space, and that we were offering the opportunity to share their experiences regarding their health, principally, and their life quality, as well as related programs and services during their incarceration. So our response rate, our response rate was like 51%. So once they came down to that community space, it was principally visitation, but sometimes education spaces as well. Like we did it in the library once. We would kind of tell people about half would just leave, and then pretty much every single person who sat with us and went through the consent documents decided to consent, save for 2 who consented and then later withdrew.
That's great. The 51% is huge for this population. And when you say they sat with you for the consent, was this kind of like as a group or one-on-one?
No, we tried to use the expectation that consent process was an educational opportunity.
Yeah.
Where we were kind of assessing and a dialogue, like to assure folks understood what it is that they were being asked to do as well. It's like the consent to teach. The expectation that there's not compensation for it, so they're not really getting anything except for the opportunity to share their story, and that the department didn't have access to their records at the individual level and the like. So yeah, they sat with us at the table, and then if they did decide to consent, there was a hard copy form. This is like tips and tricks for doing the research. Hard copy form that couldn't be stapled, so everything ended up being kind of collated in 2 big stacks. So they would sign the documents for the department, and then they would sign the documents for us. We would take ours, give them theirs, and then we would pull out our little internet disabled tablet and begin the interview.
And I guess I'm trying to picture how many of you were there that, I'm picturing that a lot of people come down,
There'd be 6 to 10 people interviewed at a time with our team.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing. All right.
Yeah.
That's great. In future talks, highlight that, because that's really impressive. So
thank you. We kind of talked a little bit about this, Jen, when we were talking about our presentation at GSA a couple years ago, which is like some of these weird tactile things we don't talk about a lot. Our department actually aided us in creating a specialized social work research practicum. So instead of taking the traditional class where you write the paper, these students who took this section with us, their research practicum was the Oak study. So they went through human subjects training with us. They went through a qualitative boot camp, and then we drove 10 to 15 students all over the state to engage in primary data collection as their research experience. So we had graduate students on the floor of death row, and it was absolutely incredible.
Wow. Okay. That's really amazing. So, just a
really
great efficient way to get research done on, a low budget, but then also incorporating education for the students into it. That's really, really amazing. So
it's really, really formative for all of us. Like, I'm so incredibly grateful that we had that structure available to us. So.
All right. And let me see. I don't want to take up all the time. Are there others that have questions?
There's some questions in the chat.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Sorry. And I asked to put the questions in the chat. Mila, let's see. Okay. So let's see. First one, I think, is from Belisha Smith, if I'm saying your first name correctly. Did any of the participants have any kind of behavioral health diagnosis or serious mental illness, or did they only have a physical health diagnosis?
Yes, everything and more. So the study involves actually a triangulation of data. So we haven't even explored the records that were provided to us, but it's a self-reported interview that we did, like using standardized measures via survey, along with behavioral health, medical, and criminal legal records from the Department of Corrections through COMS. That's their data management system. And then that is married with the longitudinal data, which will include the recidivism and health-related outcomes at the 5-year mark. So
Great.
yes.
And then, oh, go ahead. Was there someone else?
Oh, no, I saw, so that one, and then Chantal
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, so you can see that. So if anyone's not looking at it, did you all consider how social support might mitigate the anxiety to poor physical health relationship? And then I know you mentioned social capital, but I'm wondering if even some type of in-prison peer support groups could help in these situations in terms of practical implications.
Oh, great. So you totally just reminded me that I owe you a bunch of manuscripts and I'm so sorry. She was like, will you please send me these? So a couple things. We've actually done one exploration with a social support measure and a social capital measure. And the findings of that study were actually kind of strange because what we found were traditional markers of social support that might exist in the community had an inverse relationship with health outcomes. So things that might be considered protective in community dwelling older adults actually put them at risk in terms of vulnerability and trust. But that particular analysis was led by a colleague of mine, Adrienne Archuleta. So absolutely, I'm sure that social support could be meaningful. And that's all the work I do in peer caregiving with folks who are engaged in those care dyads. There's an understanding of really things that are difficult to measure, which is just to say that there's an intimacy between the caregiver and their care recipient in the space that mitigates against harm.
That's super interesting. Thank you for answering my question.
Yeah,
And
I'm
you're
so
totally
sorry.
fine on the manuscripts.
I was like, oh no.
You're good. Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, these two questions are I think, interrelated. So Elizabeth Fate is asking for you to tell us a little bit more about the IRB process that you went through. And then Hannah, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Schwendeman, I think. Can you share more about the record sharing and your plans for the records? And how did you contend with protected health information and HIPAA? Figured
Yes,
we need to address that in the IRB. And
well,
so,
that, and I don't want to take away Dr. Sneed's like fire, right? Because that's like her whole shtick for the presentation that's coming up. But I'll talk a little bit about my experience. So kind of a broad stroke is like everything takes 10 times longer than you initially anticipate, which is something we talked about in our GSA presentation. And it was from like a community engaged standpoint, like it held a lot of those values in place, which is it was dynamic, where there was shared decision making around what was being collected from the department. In fact, they are instrumental to why we use the PHQ 8 and not the PHQ 9. The PHQ 9 has an explicit indicator of suicidality. And so they made explicit that if you ask that question and someone answers yes, the study ends, that person is referred out, you don't collect their data. And so we're like, you know what? We're just not going to ask that question. So they were instrumental to the development of the measures. They even had some research questions from the cabinet level, like these are things we'd be interested to know. And so kind of the process was that was initially pitched to the department. They went through all of the measures, all of the consent forms, they affirmed it. It was submitted to the Human Subjects Committee here at U of L. And then it went through another series of revisions, which was like, we don't like this, or you can't do this, or this language needs to be revised. And so it's sort of iterative in the sense that it took several back and forths with the department and the university before we were given like a final blessing. And one of the issues I talked about at GSA a couple years ago was it's really difficult because we walk a line where we're trying to build relationships with administrators so as to ask and answer these questions, but we have to agree to their terms in many ways. And one of those was at no point can individuals have access to the study findings. So that was something we had to agree to at the outset of the project, which is absolutely, you can come and do this project, but you can't give the outcomes back to the folks who are currently incarcerated. So that was really difficult. Closely related to the protected health information in HIPAA, I mean, we have like a traditional medical consent document, which says that like, I agree to release my health information for the purposes of research. Their identifiable data is separate from their consent form. It's in hard copy. So like the digital information doesn't have that connection. But it's, there's not necessarily an expectation that the data were going to be shared just yet, in part because we haven't even received all the data. We're still engaged in the longitudinal data collection effort. We also did not have an opportunity to complete our small group interviews with staff, which were a vested constituency, nor our focus groups, because they actually stopped in March 14th, 2020. I'll never forget it. So, so the data collection is still ongoing, if that helps answer that question.
Great. Let's see. I don't know.
I
if
think
anyone
that was
else-
all the questions, Lisa.
That was all in the chat. I guess one other question I wanted to ask is about the PHQ-8. Were you able to distinguish between the impact of depression from anxiety, or how did you handle that?
It's a total dumpster fire is the answer. So that's kind of the reason we make the point that, you know, having gone into the project with a standardized measure of anxiety would have been the far more rigorous approach. I'm not an anxiety scholar by trade. So I didn't, import that. And so we make this point in the discussion section of the manuscript that, you know, we can't distinguish between whether someone is moving really quickly or moving so slowly, like kind of both ends of the poles. Scholarship kind of gives, some grace there in the sense that whether the person is more anxious or more depressed, it's a movement away from their norm. And that still remains important despite the conceptualization. But yes, had we used an anxiety measure, we could have avoided some of that sort of like, is it because you're not moving at all or because you're moving a ton? Is it because you're talking too quickly or is it because you're talking too slowly? Yeah, absolutely. Actually, so in terms of the psychometric piece, I don't know if I mentioned this, I didn't mention it in the presentation. I actually ran a Chromebook alpha to see if those individual items would hang together, and they didn't. The factor loading, like, it was a mess. The correlation was a mess. So they didn't hold enough strongly together to be an index. So that's why we tease them apart as individual items.
Yeah. Okay. Great. There aren't any more questions. I just wanted to, not to put you on the spot, Melissa, but we have our program officer here from the National Institute on Aging, Melissa Gerald, and I just wanted to give her a chance to chime in if you had any words of wisdom or questions or anything for the group about this topic.
No, I thought it was very interesting. Actually, what I was thinking about was most recently, it was like a year and a half ago, the United States Preventative Services Task Force had come forth with recommendations about screening for anxiety. Obviously, this is in community settings. And one of, I guess, how can I put it? A certain complication I guess I had when reading this recommendation was they thought of anxiety as I would have to go back to the wording. I wrote about this somewhere about their likening aging with anxiety, that anxiety was somehow like a normal part of aging. I could give you the exact quote if I look it up. It was pretty shocking to read about that. But you might want to take a look at to see what they were talking about as you're moving forward with. I can imagine a possibility where findings could lead to then a screen for anxiety, to think about some of the considerations about the relative benefits and harms of screening, and what does it actually say about screening in older age, and how to separate those two, and especially in this population, and what that would look like. So it may be a bit of a side kind of adjacent kind of lead, but I think I can see the relevance. I hear a possibility for you, and so I'll pass the link for everybody.
Yeah, that would be
Thank you so much.
In the chat, but it's a direction that I didn't hear you talk about, but I think
Oh, that's
it's
great.
relevant.
And Jen,
That was
Jen,
my thought. So
said
since I was asked.
Jen made my exact point when Jen said what she said in the chat was like, I assumed I thought my anxiety was going to go down.
No, here you go.
Great. Thank you very much, Melissa.
Sure. I'll go back off camera and
Sure. Yeah.
slither into the here.
All right. Thank you very much,
Nice
Stephanie.
talk.
All right, we're going to move on now to our presentation. And we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Rodlescia Sneed, and she is an assistant professor at the Institute of Gerontology at Wayne State University. Dr. Sneed received her master's in public health and epidemiology from Columbia University, her PhD in social health psychology from Carnegie Mellon, and she did a postdoctoral fellowship in social gerontology at the University of Pittsburgh. And Dr. Sneed is a social gerontologist who's interested in how the social environment impacts successful aging among mid and late life adults who are living in urban, economically distressed communities. Particularly related to the ARCH network, a focus of Dr. Sneed's research is how justice system involvement impacts successful aging. And to that end, she has a mentored career development award from the NIA entitled Maximizing the Scalability of the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program Among Older Adults in State Correctional Settings. But today, Dr. Sneed will talk to us about researching the aging population in state prisons, ethical considerations, and IRB requirements. So take it away, Dr. Sneed. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me. I gave an abbreviated version of this talk at GSA this past year. So thankful that Jen invited me to come today to share with the ARCH Network as well. And also grateful that Melissa Gerald's here, who's my program officer as well, to hear a little bit about what I have to say about my project. I spoke to the group, I think, in April 2023, I think the same week that my Career Development Award got funded to give an overview of the project. But I do see a lot of new faces, so I'll briefly talk about my project, but really the focus is going to be about discussing some of the ethical issues that have come up over the course of my RB process and my data collection process. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it was like both to go through the review with my institution, as well as the review that I've had to go through with the various correctional departments that I've been working with. Alrighty. Okay, so my Career Development Award involves multiple prison systems. I've been collecting data focused on prison systems experiences implementing the chronic disease self-management program. And so in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about doing multi-site research and kind of what are some of the ethical concerns and IRB considerations surrounding that. So we are a group of folks who are in particular interested in older adults who have justice system involvement. And so a lot of you may have seen a version of this slide before, demonstrating that we've had a large increase in the number of older adults who are incarcerated in state and federal prison systems over the last few decades. And so the blue line here on this graph just shows this rapid increase that we've seen from 1999 to 2016 when we talk about older adults that are incarcerated. At the same time, we've seen when we look at the population under the age of 55, we've seen that the number of older adults has been stable and has actually declined a little bit over time. But we have what is an aging crisis in the criminal justice system. And so with having a lot of older people incarcerated, we also deal with a lot of chronic disease in state prisons. This graph here shows the percentage of people in state prisons age 55 and older who have specific chronic health conditions. So we see about 62% of those age 55 plus have high blood pressure, 45% have arthritis, 1 in 4 have diabetes, and 1 in 4 have heart disease. And this is really important because despite the fact that we have a lot of chronic disease within the carceral setting, there isn't a lot of programming specifically focused on chronic disease within most state prison systems. Most of the programming that we see is focused on things like infectious disease, so prevention and treatment of things like tuberculosis or hepatitis, or most recently COVID-19. We see a lot of programming focused on mental illness and substance abuse, but there really is much less attention paid to chronic health conditions, despite the fact that we have high prevalence of these conditions among older adults who are incarcerated. And so for my Career Development Award, I've been looking at implementation of the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program, which is a program that's typically implemented in community settings. So you see it offered at lots of area agencies on aging, A lot of the land grant institutions have extension services that offer it in the community. We see it in health departments as well. And it's often implemented among individuals who have things like high blood pressure or chronic pain or diabetes. And it has a pretty large evidence base. There have been at least 10 randomized trials that have associated doing this program with good outcomes, including things like reduced risk of hospitalization and reduced medical expenditures. And the way the program works, it's a 6-week program that's done for about 2.5 hours a week. And people participate in small groups of about 10 to 15 people. It is a lay intervention. And so there are 2 leaders that are picked to lead the program, and they go through a structured training program to be prepared to lead. And the leaders typically are people who either have chronic conditions themselves or they live with someone who has a chronic condition. And a big part of the program is having lots of discussion-based conversations related to problem solving, setting goals, and action planning related to one's chronic health condition. So there's a lot of conversation about how to talk to doctors about your health condition, how to talk to your loved ones, how to eat for your chronic condition, how to get physical activity. And the component people really find to be most beneficial is the action planning, which is really focused on setting goals for yourself each week related to your chronic health condition. And so there's been a lot of interest in this chronic disease self-management program, and a lot of it started based on some pilot program funding that was available through the National Council on Aging. And they funded at least 10 programs that were focused on delivering this chronic disease self-management program within the prison setting. And so in addition to these pilot programs, other state prison systems have also worked to implement this program, either doing it themselves or partnering with agencies in the community to implement the program. But most of the work has really been done on a limited basis. So they may have done the program in one facility or done it for a short period of time, but most states haven't really implemented it on a large scale basis, such that anybody who has a chronic health condition in any facility in the state could actually implement the program if they wanted to. And so what I'm interested in is what it takes to actually scale up this program throughout a state prison system, such that anybody who wants it can participate in it. And so for my research study, I'm doing a mixed method study. We are collecting quantitative survey data and qualitative interview data from folks from 10 state prison systems. And our recruitment goal is to recruit 60 individuals from 3 groups. First, we're interested in talking to prison staff. So these are who have somehow been involved in implementation within a prison system. So either their custody staff who've been involved in logistics, they might be social workers or healthcare workers in the prison system who actually got trained to teach the program, or they might be administrators who were responsible for making sure that the program was implemented. We've also been talking to incarcerated individuals who participate in the program, either as leaders or as folks who come to receive the program each week. And then finally, we've been talking to external partners that are involved with implementation. So this will be the folks from the area agencies on aging or the extension services who have gone into the prison system each week to deliver the program. And so the first thing that people often ask me, I mentioned that we are recruiting 10 prison systems and 60 people across those systems. And so the first question people often ask me is, how did you actually make connections in the prison systems to do this kind of work? We had to get letters of support in order to make any of this possible, even to submit the grant. And how are we able actually to make any kinds of connections across systems? I'll start by saying that this network, the Arch Network, has been really helpful to me, having the opportunity to talk to folks across the country who do this work in lots of different states and make the right connections with folks within the prison system has really been helpful. We also reached out directly to the National Council on Aging, given that they funded a lot of the pilot work, and they actually reached out to a lot of the programs that they funded. And we had the opportunity to meet with them and to get their support as well, and to get letters of support from them for our grant application. We also reached out to other academics that were in states where we knew the chronic disease self-management program had been done. So I know I've met with several people here who've done work within state prison systems to talk about their experiences doing this work and to make connections with folks who could help us to get our protocols reviewed within those prison systems. We also did a lot of work to connect with external agencies that had already partnered with state prison systems to do this work. So if we knew that an area agency on aging had done work in the prison system, we reached out to them, and they in turn were able to reach out to their partners within a specific state prison system and have the opportunity to talk with them as a result. I also talked a lot about our project as much as possible. And I found this really beneficial. I would talk about what I was doing and what I was proposing to do. And I can think of a couple of instances where there were states that I didn't even know were doing the program, but there happened to be someone in the audience who said that they had partnered with the state prison system to do this work. So talking about the project everywhere I go has really been beneficial as well. I also went to conferences, in particular the National Conference on Correctional Healthcare. And for the project, actually, I was able to do some of the interviews with correctional staff at conferences, which was a bit more of a relaxed environment where they would have more time to actually talk to me. I also took advantage of the listserv for the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program. So I met with Kate Lorick, who developed this program, and told her about my project. And she gave me permission to advertise about it on the listserv. And I was able to talk to folks through that listserv who'd actually done the program. Also, just looking on the DOC websites, many of the departments of corrections list the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program as a program that they do, and sort of reaching out that way as well. I also even did Google searches. I know I found one of the states that participated in our project through a Google Scholar search, where one of the academics who had participated in the work wrote a paper about her involvement in doing this work in the state correctional settings. And so I was able to reach out to her. And she was actually one of the first people that I interviewed. And then also reaching out both to state administrators and to wardens. One thing I found is that sometimes things happen on the local level that folks at the state level were not as well informed about, and vice versa. And so if I had the support of a warden on the local level, I was actually able to leverage that quite a bit and be able to reach out to the state administrators as a result to talk about bringing our research study to their system. And then just in general, following leads that folks gave me in general, in terms of reaching out to the next person and to the next person. So I always ask any of our participants if they know of other folks within their prison system that might be willing to talk to us, and that helped quite a bit as well. All right, so the first step after we got our notice of award is that we had to go through our university IRB process. And so our university has two review boards. We have a medical review board and a social behavioral review board. Our social behavioral review board meets much less frequently than our medical review board. It only meets every other month. And so that was a bit of a challenge when we first got started, because as you know, any kind of research study that involves incarcerated populations requires that full board review. But fortunately, our university is very experienced in prison-related research. The dean of our college, for example, does a lot of prison-based research, and our School of Social Work does a lot of prison-based research as well. And so, although it took a while for us to get our full board review, our application actually got pre-screened by a member of the IRB who had a lot of knowledge about doing research with prisoners. And so she essentially did a review for us in advance of that full board review, and sent us back a list of 26 comments that we needed to respond to after that pre-screening. And so what were some of the things that we were asked about and were expected to respond to from that initial pre-screening? So one of the things that came up quite a bit in that initial pre-screening was how we were going to ensure that potential incarcerated participants felt as though they had free choice to participate. So we think about that human subjects research training that we all do that talks about respect for persons. And the fact that, you know, anyone that we attempt to recruit for our studies should be autonomous, and they should know that their participation is voluntary. But our IRV was very much concerned that people would feel pressured to participate in our research. If we think about what typically happens when you're incarcerated, you don't necessarily have a lot of free choice. You know, you don't have a choice of what time you wake up in the morning, or what time you eat, or where you sleep. And if you don't comply with certain rules, you know, there could potentially be negative consequences. And so this idea of having autonomy and free choice is in direct contrast to what everyday prison life was like. And so it was really important to our IRB to make sure that people didn't feel pressured to participate. So they wanted us to assure them, for example, that the prison staff were not going to be involved in our consent process, and that we would be the only ones actually talking to people in detail about the study. And that, you know, we would let people know that they had the right to say no. Typically, what we do is we go and we talk to people about the study, and attempt to consent them, but they can decline participating in the study. And if they decline to participate, you know, we'll allow them to just sit in the room with us for a while if they don't want people to know that they declined. We give them that option. Or if they don't want people to know that they're participating, we give them the option of just leaving their consent form with us if they're concerned about taking the consent form back to their housing unit. And so really making sure that we talk to folks quite a bit about the fact that this is a voluntary process. Another thing that came up is how we would address literacy issues. And we know that incarcerated populations tend to have reading levels below the general population. So there was concern about how we would address literacy issues, as well as addressing vision and hearing issues, given that we are working with an older population. And so we talked about the fact that we would read consent forms aloud, so that folks who had literacy issues or folks who have vision issues would still be able to consent. We also talked about having just sort of a one-sheet overview of the study in large font, so that people could get, you know, a quick overview of what was happening without being bogged down too much in the consent form. And then we also use a teach back approach when we're consenting people, where we explain how the study works and then ask them to share back with us what they understood. And this gives us an opportunity to kind of clarify any misconceptions that folks may have, or give us the opportunity to answer questions that folks may have. Incentives were also something that came up quite a bit in our initial IRB review. And so when we got our study funded, we initially said that we would give people $20 for participating in this interview, which was 60 to 90 minutes. And our IRB right away had some concern about that. They were concerned about undue influence, in that people might overlook the risks of the study just because they wanted the compensation. And this is important given that we know that incarcerated populations, when they have jobs, for the most part, earn less than $1 an hour. And I think in 14 states, they earn less than 25 cents an hour. And so we had to reduce our incentive. We reduced it to $10 for each participant, also recognizing that there were some prison systems who told us you can't give financial compensation. And so with that, we had to create two separate versions of our consent form, one for the prison systems who said we could compensate, and one for the prison systems that said we could not compensate. We also have seen a lot of differences in how incentives can be received. So there have been prison systems who told us that we needed to mail them money orders. And so we had to collect names and prison ID numbers and mail money orders. Other prison systems use the online system JPay. And so that's actually pretty easy to just go and deposit funds directly into accounts. And so there was also a lot of concern about confidentiality. And so there was a lot of concern about whether the staff were other incarcerated individuals would know if our incarcerated participants chose to participate or if they declined participation. So again, we emphasize the fact that we won't tell anybody whether you participated or not. We'll explain the study to you. And then, if you don't want to participate, that's fine. We won't tell anybody whether you decided to enroll or not. We also made it very clear that we would limit access to the interviews. So we do audio record our interviews. We use encrypted devices that are password protected, so only our team has access to the interview data. In our study, in addition to recruiting incarcerated participants, we also talked to staff participants. And so there's some concern about whether the staff would feel comfortable talking to us about what's happening on the job. And so a lot of our study, because we're asking about logistical issues associated with running a program, sometimes it could mean having criticisms of the administrators or having some kind of criticism of the department as a whole. And so there's concern about fear of disciplinary action as a result. So again, we assure people, that we're audio recording, but the audio files are password protected. We also gave people the option, if they don't want to talk to us in the office, they could participate off-site. We could do a phone interview. We're able to do electronic consenting as well, so we don't have to do the interview in person. If they want to just do it over the phone, that's fine. And so that's how we've been able to avoid some of those issues and some of those concerns. So some other issues that have come up is sort of being able to balance privacy with security. And so some prison systems may have concern about us coming into the prison system to do interviews and how that might disrupt sort of the security process that's going on within the prison system. We have some systems that have told us, it's easier if you all do the interviews remotely, and we have the capability to do that. We had one prison system, for example, that set up a WebEx or Zoom, so they allowed us to do the interviews remotely. Some systems have told us you can come in person, but it's easier if you do your interviews using the lawyer phone lines, which are secure. And so kind of being flexible to whatever kind of security concerns they have, while at the same time maintaining privacy has been important. The prison systems also have a lot of concern about confidentiality breaches. And so many of them have asked us to sign agreements saying that we won't talk about the health status of other people that are involved in our study. We won't talk about the nature of people's convictions, because even though that is public record, people within the prison system might not know that information. And so we weren't going to require people to provide us with any of that kind of information as a part of our data collection process. And then the last thing I'll mention about confidentiality is because this was a multi-state study, a lot of states were concerned that they would be singled out in our reports. So there's a lot of concern about being sued. For some reason, there was a lot of concern about media attention from a lot of the state administrators. And so we had to, be very clear about the fact that anything that we collect will be aggregated. We won't tell states which other states have participated in the study. And there's no way really that your state will be identified as a part of this work. All right, so after we did our university IRB review, most of the prison systems have their own review process, and this really varies drastically from state to state. As I mentioned, our protocol indicated that we would work with 10 different state prison systems. And so a lot of the time that my project coordinator has been spending has really been focused on navigating all of the intricacies of these various prison systems and their processes. So some of the things that we've had to submit as a part of our research review process, excuse me, most of the prison systems want to know about our credentials to do this work. They want to know the purpose of the work. They want to know how we got funding to do the project. They want to know what resources are needed in terms of space, in terms of how many people do we want to talk to so they can make plans for custody purposes. Most of the prison systems want to see copies of any of our surveys and any of our data collection tools. They want information on the expected outcomes of the research. And something really important is that they want to know how this research benefits them. Many of the prison systems said, they're not interested in people coming in to do observational research to satisfy intellectual curiosity. They really want to know how this research in some way is going to lead to quality improvement. And so we've had to talk about the benefits of understanding this chronic disease self-management program better, such that it could be implemented throughout a prison system, such that anyone who has a chronic disease would benefit. Most of the prison systems also want to know how are the results going to be used. So we very much indicate that we're going to aggregate results, we'll give presentations, but we won't be naming any of the systems in any of our reports. And then they also want to know which facilities do we need to access as well. And so some of the things that have come up in the review process, there are all types of people who tend to review some of these proposals. Administrators certainly have been involved in the review process. Sometimes it's a medical officer who does the review. And so some of the things they want to know are, is this research study methodologically sound? Do the researchers know what they're doing? Are they knowledgeable about the topic? An important one, does this project duplicate something else that we already have going on? Is it in line with our goals? And how much assistance is needed from the Department of Corrections to actually pull this research study off? So sometimes we might find that a study has scientific merit, but it requires too much from the DOC. And that department simply might not have the resources to help us. They also want to know how the research team is going to protect confidentiality. And so several of the prison systems have asked us to sign data use agreements for me and also any members of my team who might be coming into the prison system or who might be handling data after the fact. All of us have had to sign agreements in some cases. And then finally, how is this project going to actually impact prison safety and security? So folks from the custody side want to make sure that you're not going to be creating new logistical nightmares by doing your work. And so some of the restrictions that have come up from the prison systems, we've had prison systems tell us that we have to have background checks for our research team. Not in all cases, but in some. Drug and treatment trials, for the most part, most of the states have said that those are not allowed. But given that we're doing an observational study focused on quality improvement, that hasn't been an issue. Some prisons tell us that we're not allowed to bring in recording devices. So in that case, we might take a second or third person in along with the interviewer just to take really detailed notes if that's something that comes up. There are states who have told us that incentives are not allowed. And so as I mentioned before, we have a set of consent forms for the states that allow incentives and a set of consent forms for the ones that don't allow them. We also have had to sign non-disclosure agreements saying that we're not going to reveal the criminal history of participants over the course of our project. And so we don't collect any data relevant to criminal history at all. And then some states actually have their own IRBs that we've had to navigate. We ran into a problem early on where one of the states wanted to be the IRB record as opposed to our university to be the IRB of record. But we were able to resolve that by simply indicating, that the state wasn't going to actually be involved in the data collection process. And so through some conversations with our program officer and folks at the NIH, we were able to resolve that. But there are states who have their own formal IRB that is involved in research. And then most of the states have told us that they want some kind of final report back to them. They want to know what we did, what impact it had, and how it's going to lead to some sort of quality improvement goal going forward. And so we're keeping track of the requirements for each state. Some of them have an actual form that they want us to complete. Some of them have also indicated, that they might want to receive this before we actually publish anything about the project. So it's really state specific in terms of the requirements for reporting. And then another thing that we discovered is that some states charge an IRB review fee. And this can range from a couple $100 to $3,000 in some cases. If it's for initial review, usually the cost is higher, as well as some states require amendments, and there's a fee associated with that as well. All right, so in terms of the lessons that we've learned, one of the biggest things that we've learned in working with different states is that we have to follow up regularly. Every state has its own review process, and sometimes things get stuck at one step. And so it's taken my project coordinator following up every couple of weeks along the approval path to make sure we're getting the approval that we need at every step. As others have mentioned, expect a long process. So from the time that we submit an application to a prison system until we get permission, can take 6 to 12 months in some cases. And so really this isn't something that you can do quickly. The other thing that we discovered is that institutional memory can sometimes be a challenge because we were asking people about their past participation in a program. We saw a lot of turnover, both in terms of the staff and incarcerated participants. And so that's just something to think about if you're doing a historical study like this. And then finally, really being flexible. As prison systems told us they needed certain things, we had to modify our IRB documents such that we could accommodate them. So being really flexible to the nuances of the different prison systems has really been important. And so just to give you an idea of where we are in our study now, I mentioned our grant started in April 2023. We got our IRB approval pretty quickly in June. We enrolled our first non-incarcerated participant in October of 2023. Our first incarcerated participants were enrolled a few months ago in October. And right now we're at the end of year 2 of our grant, and we're about halfway through in terms of our recruitment. We've submitted applications to about 13 prison systems, and we've had 3 that denied us so far, either because they didn't have access to the staff who would know anything about the program, or because they told us it wasn't a good time and encouraged us to apply again later on. And so I just want to acknowledge the members of my team who have helped with this, my project coordinator, Elena, as well as my co-investigators. And then just also our funding, again, is from the National Institute on Aging. And with that, I will take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rodlescia. This was great. Let's see. Jen, hey, why don't you start us off? See, you have your...
I was clapping, but I will.
Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, I'll just say, I'm so in awe that you took on so many departments of perfection. I just continually oh, and you've done it so well. So thanks for sharing. I wanted to know, I'm wondering if you could reflect on, I feel like a lot of what you talked about were a lot of ethical trade-offs that you sort of have to make. Is it okay if we can't compensate folks or can't compensate them the way we like? Is it okay if we, have to give this type of information or this type of access to the DOC? Is it changing your protocol? I'm curious how you weigh that, or are there lines you didn't want to cross? How did you decide what you could or couldn't take on, especially for a K award, which again has to be emphasized. This is, yeah.
Well, I think the issue of compensation, because I think from the jump, I think a lot of the correctional systems, that's just their policy in general, that they don't allow compensation, which I think is understandable. On the one hand, you don't want people to participate in studies for the money. But at the same time, for me as a community engaged researcher, compensation is really important to me. But, recognizing the fact that, this is the processes this prison system has, and getting this information is more beneficial in the long run in terms of improving outcomes for folks who are incarcerated. So even though we might not be able to compensate people financially, by doing this study, we're ultimately leading to some type of quality improvement. And honestly, the folks that we've compensated have been surprised that we wanted to compensate them, and really wanted to share their experiences because they valued participating in the program. And it's sort of the same issue that many of them have in systems where they're doing the program in terms of the types of incentives that they're allowed to get. So we talk to folks about doing the program and kind of what would make people want to do the program. And they'd say things like, it'd be really nice if we could get some kind of incentive while we're incarcerated in the prison, and that wasn't possible. But just recognizing that really getting this information is important and being flexible to the needs of the prison system was important. One of the things that we did even before we applied for permission to actually do the research was just talk to folks in the prison system and saying, what do you need? How can we help you? What can we do to make your lives easier in some kind of way? To let them know that we recognize that this can be a big lift, even more than we might have realized coming in, but that we didn't want to waste their time. And we were only doing this because we found real benefit to having a program like this in the prison system. And so just kind of being flexible to the things that they told us and kind of understanding the rationale for why they had the rules that they had and kind of trying to just work with them, recognizing that, at the end of the day, we want to get this done.
Oh, here's a question from, let's see, Radha Sadacharan. And she's saying that, sorry if she missed this, are you going to go back and share the information or what you learn with the individuals that you interview once the study is completed?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the main things that people asked us, in terms of during the consent process. How am I going to find out what happened as a result of this study? So it's very important for us to do dissemination, not only through journal publications, but also giving information back to the people that we interview as well. So we have plans absolutely to disseminate our findings back to the interviewees, as well as to the prison systems overall.
And Rodlescia, I think I missed this. How are you speaking with the individuals who are incarcerated, given that they could be from all over the country?
So basically what we're doing, so first, because we have a very narrow group of people that we're interested in talking to. So first, the prison staff do have to let us know, they have to know who's eligible for the program.
Mm-hmm.
So they know who's participated in this chronic disease self-management program.
Okay.
And so from there, depending on the prison system, sometimes they put up flyers and tell folks, we have folks who are going to come today to talk about this program. If you're interested, take this flyer and bring it back to us, and then they'll be able to talk to you about the study. We've had prison systems who are pretty high tech, and so they send out electronic notifications. The folks in their system have tablets, for example, so they send out electronic notifications to folks that might be eligible and tell them to come talk to us, and then we can arrange to go to the prison system at that point to talk to them about the study. So there's a little bit of involvement from the prison system just because we're only recruiting people who've been involved in this chronic disease self-management program. But once we make that initial connection, they're no longer involved, and we actually talk about the study and do the consenting going forward after that.
And definitely one word that comes to mind is tenacity. And just, oh my goodness, that really you've taken on a lot to do this, but it's amazing. Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask Dr. Sneed regarding the IRB process, or does anyone have any general comments or questions?
I saw Cynthia's hand was up. I
Oh,
don't know
sorry,
if
did I miss Cynthia? All right. Cynthia, do you have a question? Maybe not.
Maybe not.
She might have stepped
Oh,
away.
there she is.
Oh,
No, if you meant
she
me,
is.
I didn't. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to have my hand up, but
Okay.
thank you. I just I was resonating. I've just recently gotten through IRB for a single state project, and yeah, so I was just resonating with everything you were saying. It was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and also mention that, because I have a career development award, my mentors have a lot of experience doing work in the justice system as well. So lots of conversations about sort of how to navigate some of these issues have come up. And so being able to talk to my mentors was really beneficial as well. Melissa has a hand up.
Yes.
Hi, so I can't tell you how pleased I am to hear you present, obviously, I hope. I just was struck by how methodical you've been in terms of detailing the different obstacles that you've been faced with in trying to do this work along the way. And from the perspective of a program officer who, I receive a fair share of applications and in this area, shall we say, and with people who really sometimes they don't always know like a half of what you are dealing with. And I'm just wondering, and then there are others who are saying, why aren't we doing this type of research without knowledge of necessarily these constraints? How do you have a plan, shall we say, in moving forward and disseminating information about here are the types of obstacles when it's faced with in conducting this type of research? I think it would be
Absolutely
valuable for the.
Yeah, so I actually did a talk on this at the annual meeting at GSA this year, which Jen came to. I also have a manuscript on my computer right now that I'm writing that's almost done, that'll summarize a lot of this as well. So I'm definitely planning to put this information out. And one of the things that I get asked all the time whenever I talk about the project is, tell me about the IRB process. So I've actually done a lot of talks about the IRB process, both at my institution and with other groups who have interest in kind of thinking about navigating the IRB process as well.
I'm thinking more in terms of the correctional process that would be very challenging for researchers who don't have your background and experience navigating the system in terms of the sort of naivete that comes with doing this work, thinking I'll just show up and do this. And so but that's great. You can whisper to me if you want in the chat privately where you're submitting it. Since I'm really curious, or you can tell everybody, whatever. I won't tell anyone.
Okay.
But congratulations, it's really great. I'm really happy.
Thank you.
And I think getting that information out there, as Melissa was saying, you had that slide about all the different contacts that you made, and someone made a comment in here about thank you for sharing how you made these tough connections. And so having that in the literature would just be really, really helpful, because I think there's a lot of people that want to do this, but yet don't even know where to start. Who should they contact? So that'll be great to have. Good luck. We look forward to that being published very soon.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us. As always, Jen had put in the chat, if anyone has any work they would like to share, if anyone has any particular interest that you would like to hear about, feel free to contact us at any time. And we certainly all hope that you will join us in person at the annual meeting in March. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. So good seeing folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Melissa.
Take care.
Thanks.